"You should really be thanking us for letting you live so close," Gerald said. The same line he'd used at nearly every family dinner for 6 years, swirling the wine in his glass like the comment cost him nothing at all. I set my fork down and looked at him for a long moment before I finally said what I'd been holding back since the closing documents arrived 18 months earlier. "Gerald, I actually need to tell you something about the neighborhood. My name is Elise Bowman. I'm 34, an urban planner by training, and this is the story of the dinner where I finally told my father-in-law, who actually owned the ground his house was sitting on. To understand that dinner, you have to understand Cedar Hollow, the development where my husband Trent grew up, and where his parents, Gerald and Paulette Whitfield, had lived for over 30 years. Cedar Hollow was built in the 70s, under an arrangement that's more common than people realize, but rarely understood by the homeowners living inside it. Residents owned their houses outright, the physical structures, the roofs, the walls, everything above the foundation. What they didn't own was the land itself. The lots were held under long-term ground leases, 99 years originally, administered by a holding company that collected annual lease payments and controlled what happened to the underlying parcels once those leases expired or changed hands. Most residents of Cedar Hollow had lived there so long they'd stopped thinking about the distinction entirely. The lease payments were modest, folded quietly into their annual dues, and nobody spent much time wondering who actually held title to the dirt beneath their homes. Gerald certainly never did. He talked about Cedar Hollow like he owned every inch of it, the streets, the shared green space, the reputation of the neighborhood itself, and by extension, he talked about anyone who lived nearby as though they existed there by his generosity. When Trent and I got engaged, Gerald made it clear, more than once, that he'd pulled some invisible string to help us find a house 2 streets over from theirs. "Not everyone gets a spot in Cedar Hollow," he told me at our engagement dinner, in front of his golf partner and the man's wife. "You should feel fortunate we made room for you." I didn't correct him that night. I learned early in my relationship with Trent that correcting Gerald in public rarely went well, and I wanted the engagement dinner to stay pleasant for Trent's sake. But the comment stuck with me, the way comments do when they're delivered just often enough to feel less like a joke and more like a belief. Over the years that followed, the comment became a pattern. At Thanksgiving, he'd mention how the neighborhood association had made an exception letting us in. At my daughter's christening, held in his backyard, he told the priest, loudly enough for half the yard to hear, that Trent's wife had married up into a real neighborhood. At a dinner 2 Christmases ago, he referred to our house as being on the outskirts of the good part, despite it sitting 1 street closer to the entrance than his own. I absorbed all of it the way you absorb things from a father-in-law you're trying to keep peace with for the sake of your marriage and your children. Trent occasionally pushed back, quietly, telling his father to knock it off, but Gerald never really heard him. He'd built an entire identity around being one of the original families of Cedar Hollow, and that identity required people around him to understand their place relative to his. It wasn't just me he did it to, either. He'd mentioned to a neighbor once, within earshot of my sister-in-law, that the association had made room for a young couple 2 blocks over. A comment that had nothing to do with property lines and everything to do with who Gerald had decided belonged and who merely tolerated. My sister-in-law brought it up to Trent once, half joking, asking if their father had always talked about the neighborhood like a kingdom he presided over. Trent said he had, for as long as either of them could remember, and that their mother had simply stopped correcting him sometime in the early 90s. What changed things wasn't a decision I made out of spite. It started with my grandmother's estate, 18 months before that dinner. My grandmother, a woman named Odette Marchetti, had spent decades investing carefully and quietly in real estate around the region, building a modest but genuinely valuable portfolio that almost nobody in the family fully understood the scope of until she passed. Part of that portfolio, it turned out, was a controlling interest in a holding company called Meridian Land Partners. the entity that had purchased the ground lease rights for several older developments in the area decades earlier, including, as I discovered only after reviewing the estate documents with my grandmother's attorney, Cedar Hollow itself. I remember sitting in that attorney's office, a careful, unhurried woman named Miss Okafor, going through page after page of holdings I hadn't known existed. When she reached the section on Meridian Land Partners and its underlying parcels, she read off a list of development names, and Cedar Hollow was third on the list. "Your grandmother acquired the controlling interest almost 20 years ago," Miss Okafor told me. "It's a relatively passive holding. The leases were already in place. She simply collected the underlying rent and held the reversion rights." I sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over. My grandmother, who had once sat at Gerald's table and smiled politely while he explained the merits of Cedar Hollow to her, had spent 2 decades quietly holding legal title to the ground his house sat on, and he had never known it, because there was never a reason for him to ask. I didn't tell Trent right away. It felt like the kind of thing that needed time to settle before I said it out loud to anyone, even him. When I finally did explain it, sitting at our kitchen table with the estate documents spread out between us, he was quiet for a long time. "So we technically hold the lease on my parents' house," he said eventually. "The trust does," I said, "which I'm now a trustee of, along with my mother. It's not really about us personally holding anything over your dad, it's just true. Are you going to tell him?" "I don't know yet," I said, and for a long time I genuinely didn't. I had no interest in using it as a weapon. My grandmother hadn't held it as a weapon either, as far as I could tell from the records. It had simply been one investment among many, managed quietly and without any particular agenda toward the people living on top of it. What changed my mind wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the accumulation of 18 more months of the same comments, sharpened now by something I understood that Gerald didn't. Every time he told me how fortunate I was to live near his neighborhood, I thought about the folder in Miss Okafor's office, the one with Cedar Hollow's name on the third line of a list he'd never see. The dinner where it finally came out wasn't a special occasion. It was an ordinary Sunday dinner at Gerald and Paulette's house, the kind we had roughly once a month, with our daughter drawing at the far end of the table while the adults talked over her head. Gerald had just finished a long story about a new family who'd moved into the development, complaining that the neighborhood association had let their standards slip by approving the sale. "They're lucky the board even considered them," he said. "People don't understand what it takes to keep a place like this exclusive." "Gerald," I said, setting down my fork, "I actually need to tell you something about the neighborhood." He looked at me, mildly amused, the way he usually did when I spoke up at dinner, as though whatever I was about to say would be a minor correction he'd tolerate before returning to his point. "My grandmother's estate included a company called Meridian Land Partners," I said. "It's the holding company that owns the underlying ground lease for Cedar Hollow, has for about 20 years. I found out when she passed, 18 months ago. I'm one of the trustees now." The table went quiet in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, even Paulette setting her glass down slowly, even Trent going still beside me. "That's not possible," Gerald said. "We own our home outright. I paid off that mortgage 15 years ago. You own the house," I said. "The structure. What you've never owned is the land underneath it. It's a ground lease community, Gerald. It has been since it was built. The lease payments have been folded into your association dues this whole time. I'd guess most people here never think about it because it's never mattered until now." He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him do the same math I'd done in Miss Okafor's office, working backward through 30 years of assumptions about what he actually held title to. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that this entire time some company owns the ground under my house, and now you're telling me it's yours?" "It's not mine personally," I said. "It's the trust's. I didn't buy it, I didn't choose it, and I'm not planning to do anything with it that changes your lease terms. I just think it's worth mentioning, since you've spent 6 years telling me how lucky I am to live near a neighborhood you don't actually own." His face went through several stages: disbelief, something close to embarrassment, and then a kind of defensive anger that I recognized as the same tone he used whenever something didn't fit the version of events he preferred. "This is exactly the kind of thing that gets used against people," he said. "You're going to hold this over us." "I haven't done anything with it in 18 months, I said. "I'm not planning to now either. I just got tired of the comments, Gerald. The idea that we should be grateful you let us live nearby, when it turns out the actual ground under your own house belongs to a trust I help manage." It felt worth saying out loud, finally, instead of just absorbing it the way I have for years. Paulette, who had said very little the entire dinner, finally spoke, her voice quieter than her husband's. "Gerald, maybe it's time to stop talking about the neighborhood like it's something you personally hand out to people." He didn't have much to say to that. The rest of the dinner was subdued, plates cleared quietly, our daughter oblivious to the shift in the room, still drawing at the far end of the table. In the weeks that followed, Gerald did what I expected him to do, which was research the situation himself, calling the neighborhood association, asking questions he'd apparently never thought to ask in 30 years of living there. He found out, the way most people eventually do when they actually look into these arrangements, that the ground lease was exactly as I'd described it: unremarkable, decades old, quietly managed, entirely legal, and completely unrelated to any leverage I had any interest in exercising over his household specifically. He never fully apologized, not in the direct way I might have wanted. What changed instead was quieter. The comments about luck and generosity stopped almost entirely. At the next family dinner, when a new neighbor came up in conversation, he didn't say anything about people being fortunate to live there. He simply mentioned that the neighborhood had a lot of long-term residents who'd watched it change over the decades. A much more honest description than anything he'd said in the 6 years I'd known him. Paulette told me privately a few weeks later, over coffee while Trent and his father worked on something in the garage, that she'd wanted to say something to Gerald for years about the way he talked about the neighborhood, but had never found the moment or the nerve. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He just never had anyone tell him no in a way that stuck." I told her I understood that better than she probably realized, and that I hadn't set out to be the one to finally say it. Only that 18 months of knowing something he didn't had made it impossible to keep hearing the same comment without responding to it eventually. Trent asked me once, a few months later, whether I regretted saying anything at all, whether it had been worth disrupting a relationship that was already strained in smaller ways. "I don't think I disrupted it," I told him. "I think I just stopped letting a false version of it stand. He can still believe he built something meaningful in that neighborhood. He just can't tell me I'm lucky he let me live near it, not when the ground under his own house says otherwise." We still go to dinner at Cedar Hollow once a month. Gerald still talks too much about the neighborhood association and still has opinions about every new family that moves in. But he asks me questions now, sometimes, about how ground leases work, about what happens when they eventually come up for renewal decades from now. Questions from a man who spent 30 years assuming he understood exactly what he owned, and who finally, if reluctantly, learned that he didn't. My grandmother never explained why she held on to Meridian Land Partners for so long, quietly, without ever mentioning it to anyone outside her own attorney. I think about that sometimes, sitting in Cedar Hollow at those monthly dinners, watching Gerald measure his words more carefully than he used to. I don't think she was holding on to it for a moment like that dinner. I think she simply understood something Gerald never did, that real ownership rarely announces itself loudly, and that the people who talk the most about what they've built are often the ones who understand the least about what's actually underneath it.